So I really want to talk about this question of inequality and social opportunity. And I want to try to go beyond the current discussions that we have about inequality and social opportunity to look at things like creating possibilities, which are the capabilities we talked about before. A lot of the literature talks mainly about the structure of tax and transfer policies. So we exactly have policies where we're talking about redistribution. And there's a very rich literature about the optimal tax transfer policy. And what I want to talk about is something that is complementary. It's not really based on the same, it's attacking the same question about inequality and social opportunity, but it's looking at skill formation. And you can think of it as a kind of human capital approach, but with a broader notion about the kind of skills. So we've already heard about this, although I'm going to give you a much more focused notion of capability. So I'm not going to talk much about the political and social opportunities to function, like having a free press or being able to vote or something. Those are things that many people would say are intrinsically Western values or values of certain societies. I don't want to get that far. I really want to talk about the capacity to function, and that's going to be really quite inclusive. And so it's putting together various aspects of Becker's human capital, which is, in some sense, very complementary, I think, with Sin's notion about distributive justice in terms of capacities. But it's a theory of how these capabilities emerge. So the first thing I want to mention, and it's a key theme of all this work, is that these capabilities are multidimensional. When we think about what we mean by human capital, or we think about what it takes to succeed, most people are thinking about IQ, or most people are thinking about some measure of intelligence, or maybe thinking about education. And I really want to focus, boy, this is really intrusive, these devices, I must say. I feel like I'm about to be operated on or about to die or something. Anyway, so the capabilities are multidimensional. And I want to show that by some examples, and I posted some other work on cognitive, non-cognitive, and health capacities. But the key notion is these are skills. Frequently people use the word traits, and traits are associated with being immutable, that somehow these are traits that are fixed, even though, as we will discuss, there are strong genetic components, and the heritability literature, such as it is, will argue that many things like IQ and personality and so forth have heritabilities of 50%, which is quite high. I still want to argue there's a very strong component that's environmentally determined, and that's the whole issue. I'm not sure it gets to the depth of the question that Steve was talking about, although some people would frame the genetic versus environmental issue as responsibility versus not responsible. I'm going to challenge that in a minute with some examples. But what I really want to do is show that there is a lot of flexibility, and capabilities open up, they change, and we've learned a lot about human capability formation. And the family is playing a very important role. Schools are important, but what's going on before people enter school, it turns out to be very important. And I want to try to organize many of these dimensions, all those 11 different aspects, or however many aspects I put down, health, education, crime, unifying this by a framework of capability formation, dynamic capability formation. And so I want to not argue, as I've tried to argue earlier today, that all inequality is caused by skills, but it's a major contributor, as you saw in terms of the graph I put up. Now, what do we know? And this is a fact that's been uncovered in a number of different papers. Keene and Wolpen, in a paper published in the JPE some 16 years ago. More recent work by myself and Flavio Cunha and Salvador Navarro, Johnson, Navarro himself, Huggett. Various ways have been created. Various strategies have led to the same general conclusion that at least 50% of lifetime inequality in earnings is due to factors that are in place. And in fact, we have some ways of estimating not only they're in place by age 17 or 18, but they actually are known by agents. So there really is a sense in which there's that early life factors, if you count the first 18 years, as early life are playing a very huge role. So quantitatively, if you look at earnings inequality, we're getting a lot of importance of factors determined before people enter college. But the question then becomes, and from the point of view of social policy, what do we make of it? What do we learn from all of this literature? And the question is, how early is early? How important are the gaps that emerge? What can you do about the emergence of the disadvantage? And how resilient are people in terms of being able to recover from early disadvantage? And so I want to try to go beyond. This is a theme, I think, of a lot of these lectures. There's a very large literature showing that early life conditions matter. Important treatment effects have been found for starvation in China during the Great Famine, starvation in Europe during the Second World War. But there's a question that actually is out there, whether or not we can understand the mechanisms that produce these treatment effects and what we can do about it in terms of policy. So let me start with something that looks very, very different from maybe what you've seen about this discussion. And this is very familiar. This actually is something that Alan Kruger put in play when he was still head of the Council of Economic Advisors, but the so-called Gatsby curve. And this is kind of typical of the discussion of inequality. And Steve's going to talk about social inequality, social mobility, and I'm going to talk about it here just to motivate some very simple structure of what the questions are. And what I'm trying to suggest is this curve, if you look, for example, at what's called the intergenerational elasticity, which I put up earlier today, and now you see it here on the left-hand side, regressing the income over some average level of one generation on the income of the previous generation, you see a relationship, which is the so-called Gatsby curve relationship. This is from a recent paper by Miles Korek, but there are many incarnations of this. And what you see is that, generally speaking, as you look at higher income inequality in the society, whether it's family or individual, this happens to be household inequality, but nonetheless, if you look at the measure of inequality and you look at the coefficient beta, a higher coefficient being associated with less mobility across generations, less mobility, just change, you see a positive relationship. I circled China because it's really high in the scale. In fact, some recent estimates that suggest it may be even higher. But Peru is even higher. A lot of the Latin American countries are showing a very strong inequality. So you can kind of look at inequality in the conventional way, and you can also look at social mobility. So the question is, what do we make of such an empirical relationship? How can we dig more deeply into this? And so the real question is, what does income measure? I already put up a graph showing you how different educational attainment rates are by family income. So family income is a well-known correlate of child success, educational attainment, child illness, and so forth and so on. The question is, what does it mean? And more importantly, when we go back here, many people have interpreted it to say, oh, clearly the way to reduce this beta, to increase social mobility across generations, is to reduce inequality in the cross-section. So tax transfer policies would actually reduce this. So now we're down here. That's part of the inequality reduction in Denmark, Norway, and Finland, remember, is the post-tax transfer system. I showed that earlier today. So the idea is, well, we should move in that direction, and that kind of redistributive policy is actually going to promote social mobility. That's a kind of the danger that we saw in many examples in economics. The Phillips curve is probably one of the more famous ones of another generation where people took a correlation seriously. The question is, should we take this correlation seriously and treat it as a causal relationship? So I want to look at this briefly and then look at the things that under. And Steve, you can stop me at any point if I'm poaching too much on your territory. What's that? Well, careful, he's throwing away his lecture. Or he's going to correct all the mistakes. That's even better. So this is what I had. If you had trouble reading on the ordinate, now you can see it. This is really the IGE, which shows up in the literature. And there's a very vast literature looking at, very vast, a very extensive literature going back to Lowry, Becker and Tomes, a recent summary, Solon, 2004, and Black and Devereaux have a nice survey paper in the Handbook of Labor Economics. Let me just sketch very briefly what this literature claims. And this is just a very toy example. I don't want to spend much time on it, but you've probably seen versions of it. But if just using a standard notation and using, in fact, the notation that Solon has in his papers, you see the tax rate, tau, proportional tax, and we imagine a family that's credit constrained in a very stiff sense, that you can only borrow, you can't leave negative debts to your children. And in fact, in this particular form, parents can spend their income either on current consumption or on investing in children. And the human capital of the child, here I have my pointer, the human capital of the child, the particular functional form isn't playing such a big deal, but let me just show you as it is, because it produces some nice results. Well, I'm not going to waste time with the algebra, just to point to the results, that the human capital child in the next generation is going to be a function of some parameter psi. So this is just made up, where you actually add together government and parental investment. So there's a strong assumption of perfect substitutes. And then there's the child initial endowment. And Becker and Tomes extend it. So this is the technology, this is a technology of human capital production. One period generations living over time. Now, how does the endowment proceed? And this is the typical profile. The typical profile in this literature, the typical model, is to say, okay, we think of E, that shock that's associated with things besides investment, as a genetic component, or as something that's determined that's exogenous to the process. And this is like the ability of the father. This is the ability, say, of the son. So we see a transmission process where we get a stationarity, so you get a regression to the mean, and then the earnings equation on top of that is basically just going to be the price, the return on human capital, the so-called W here, H1 plus an intercept. So this is the payment per unit of human capital, although it's in logs. So so that's the pricing equation. And then finally, to complete the story, we come up with a model in which the family is maximizing the utility, which consists of two components: its own consumption, and then the income of the next generation. And the income of the next generation, so obviously delta is the matter of altruism, degree of altruism. Delta is equal to 0. It wouldn't do any of the investment. And so if you grind out the equation, you get a very simple equation here, linear in y naught and q naught, where you're getting an offset, a perfect offset. You can show, not a perfect, but an offset, a substantial offset. Government investment is going to be offsetting private investment. And the additional piece to this puzzle, to this very simple model, and again, these functional forms can be modified, but at the cost of more algebraic complexity. I just want to explain the main idea, is that we're basically asking, is this a more or less progressive system? So how does the government provision depend on log y naught? And this is a convenient form where we're getting more progressivity the higher the value of gamma. So out of all this, if you just solve the equation, I'm not going to go through the details, you come up with what is the structural relationship here, if you will, which looks like log y1, some intercept term, and then the parameters, this progressivity, this productivity, this human capital price, all going together. And so you could think the structural version of beta would actually be this combination of things in brackets. And so this gives you a kind of a natural way to think about how government policy, private markets, and the efficiency of the parents, just the efficiency of producing human capital from one generation to the other side is producing it. And then this is actually the price of ability, if you want to think about it as a factor model. So, of course, this is not what least squares is estimating. It's not estimating this coefficient. And the reason is because there's a genetic impulse across the generations. And so one of the most common empirical regularities is that more higher income families have better performing children. And the real question is whether or not that's because of the heritability of the trait, the E1, or it's because of the investment behavior of the child. Well, here we know that E1 is going to be correlated with Y naught simply through the common shock E naught. I mean, literally Y naught also depends on E naught. So you have to control for it. And if you do that, you come up with what the beta was that we had before. So this actually would give you what the least squares coefficient is estimating. Remember, what I put up before was a least squares coefficient. This is a structural coefficient, a very simple structural coefficient, holding constant E1. But of course, E1 is correlated with Y naught. So then this is giving you something that's very simple, and that's the reason why it's used. So if we assume in steady state, which we're definitely not in, but if we had a steady state, then you can see that the beta would be increasing. This intergenerational elasticity, this mark of lack of social mobility, would be increasing as the degree of heritability went up, as the productivity of producing human capital went up, as the price went up, and as the degree of progressivity goes down. So that's all very simple. It's a very nice framework. Analytically, it's very simple, and people have tried to fiddle with it, although surprisingly less has been done fitting across countries than probably should be done. Now, why am I going on about this with the Gatsby curve? Because, except for some constants, and if I look at the innovation, the cross-section variance in income, the sigma, what I called before, that is going to be proportional to the innovation that occurs in the... So basically, we're going to see a very tight relationship between this beta and the variance of income. And this can rationalize the Gatsby curve. Gives us the Gatsby curve. And so people say, aha, there we have it. All we need to do now is just sort out these different components. And I've already told you that people have estimated heritability is at around 50%. I could tell you many other stories about heritabilities. Like, does anybody know that heritability estimated in the usual way of the knowledge of French? You know it?
Sure, it's well above 50%.
It is. It's 0.8. Knowledge of physics, too, by the way. There's other genetically determined things. Okay. But anyway, what's that?
Knowledge of economics.
It hasn't been studied. It's too small a field, I guess. I'm not sure. So the question, though, is really the following. And here, I don't want to steal your thunder. I'm going to talk an aspect of social mobility. But the real question, and it's a question that runs through this whole literature, is income the proper summary of family influence? And are credit constraints really important? This is a very extreme model of credit constraints. You can't really leave, you really are, each generation is linked to the other only through the investment. The theory of government, where Q naught came from, is really kind of not even fully developed. So it's the real question, how do families operate? It's an open, eternal question. It will be with us as long as we have the human race. But I think we've made some real progress, and I want to show what the evidence is, both evidence, both data and notion. So out of this, some people have taken from the Becker-Tomes model that educational, that if you had, quote, like complete contingent claims markets or something of the sort, that you would have no family influence effect. But we can see, and I'll show you in a minute, that that's really not true. That even with perfect borrowing markets, which were not allowed for in this simple framework, that family influence is going to play a major role. And it's not just through the genetic component. It could also be through the investment decisions of parents. But let me make that more precise. So the question is, how much is this a guide? So there's a huge amount of literature on this. This literature, I've chosen this Gatsby curve because it's so much in play. It's not because I just happen to like it or dislike it. So let me summarize some relevant findings and then start with a sequence of models and then go from these models to consider where we stand. So the first thing that we understand is something like ability matters. Maybe I should use the word capabilities. We're thinking about certain things like IQ, things like personality traits and the like. Matter, they predict, although I showed you already earlier how predictive they were. By no means are we talking about the whole story. IQ plus personality at most did about 15, 16% of the variation. So it's not like we're explaining everything with any of these theories. But nonetheless, they do explain something. But the key part is three. There's a lot of belief out there that these are traits, that these abilities, these capabilities are somehow determined at birth. Just like in my E1, E0, those were initial conditions. And what I want to argue is those abilities are created, and they are not solely genetically determined. And a key point, and we're going to have a lot of evidence on this, is how exactly even the genetic matter, the genetic material, is actually going to be determined, or at least its expression is going to be determined by environmental effects. And so let me just show you that, because it's interesting. So that's a key ingredient in this literature, is kind of a genetic determination or some kind of exogenous determination. Usually there's an appeal to genetics that lambda parameter, or regress, I have the autoregressive of E1 on lambda E0 plus some innovation chi, that's somehow the manifestation of a genetic process. And what I want to talk about is just briefly show you, there's an emerging literature showing that even that distinction. So I'm going to go through a list and make a few digressions on the list. There really are, though, evidence of environmental effects of gene expression. And let me just show you what some of the literature is. This, I claim, is exhibit number A. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you haven't. You haven't seen it before. Oh, it's too bad. Now you have. That's good. What this is this is a fairly recent paper, 8 years old now, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it's on what are data on various SNPs, various parts of the gene of identical twins. We know that identical twins by construction have identical DNA. But DNA is nothing by itself. DNA needs something to be triggered. DNA so the expression of DNA is exactly what produces what we are, our behaviors, our diseases, our manifestations. And so what we see here is, so here are some 3-year-old twins, here are 50-year-old twins. And without getting into all the details of the genetics, here are different sample sizes, but in different parts of the genome. But the important thing to see is you notice the colors are slightly different, left and right. And the colors are quite different between left and right. That's a marker for gene expression. And it's gene expression that actually is the way genes operate. So what we see is identical twins, allegedly the same biology, and they do have the same genetics. There's no question. They have the same DNA. The way that the DNA is expressing itself, here is a particularly vivid distinction, is already different. While the 50-year-olds, certainly true, but it's already starting to show up among 3-year-olds. Experience is literally getting into the expression of the genes. So when you do the standard ACE models, where you're doing in experience versus environment, you're seeing dramatic differences. I think dramatic differences. Now, open question is how important is any of this empirically? And Gabriella will tell us about that later. But let me show you another example, which is I like very much. It's from a paper that was published actually a little bit earlier than 2008, but at a seminar I was at NIA a few years ago. There's a famous study that's ongoing in New Zealand called the Dunedin cohort. The Dunedin cohort literally starts with families when the kids are born and follows the kids into their adulthood. Now they're in their late 30s. Very rich. They collected a lot of genetic data and so forth. They also, there's not an experiment here, but there is a long-term observational study. Well, it turned out they could measure by various ways, both external self-reports, various kinds of ways, various aspects of the environment of the family. And I'm going to show you some sharp differences across socioeconomic groups in family environments. So we actually saw, and they actually saw, Terry Moffat in her work showed, that there's like 14% of the kids are having maternal rejection. They get harsh discipline. There are various kinds of ways, physical abuse, sexual abuse, 12%. So they could actually measure what the inequality of the family environment is. I'm going to return to that. Now, the reason why I mention this, though, is Moffat did this great study. This actually appeared in Science now 11 years ago, and it's been replicated, but not universally. Prior to the time Moffat had enterprise, there was a whole literature about the genetic determination of crime. And so there was viewed that a certain gene was very predictive of who was going to be a criminal. In fact, there was even a book. Herrnstein and Wilson, right, were writing exactly. James Q. Wilson were writing on saying, okay, we can kind of predict the crooks. They never quite gave you the R squared of the prediction equation, which was never particularly high either. But the candidate gene was this MAOA. The exact name is not so important, but it was localized to this gene. But there are two versions of this gene. And it turned out to be something very interesting, and this is what Moffat and her co-authors located. That what you found is that if you looked at measure of conduct disorder, so this is a precursor to criminal activity, aggressive behavior when the kid's still fairly young, that what you found is that when children were in fairly tame, think of it as middle class environments, that the conduct disorder among those who had the allele, those who didn't, and those who did, was more or less the same. There's no difference. Where did the difference start to appear? Only in interaction with the environment. And that's another sense. It's entirely consistent with my previous graph. In fact, there's a huge body of work on this, and I'll show you some of our own work here. So the question is, how do these early experiences, so this is literally getting under the skin. And so again, we're asking, what's the role of a family mechanism? Well, there's a very interesting paper. I think it was recently published, right, Gabriella? The Meany, Sumi, and Ziff paper is now 2012 or 2013. Yeah. And basically, what they show is that if you look at monkeys, and we'll talk a lot more about monkeys in a second here, but if you look at monkeys who are genetically very similar to us, they share many common genes, then we can actually subject them experimentally. Oh, I noticed that Jane Goodall was starting to limit the use of monkeys at NIH. I saw that. It was in the newspaper last week. So maybe, what's that?
Primates are out.
Primates are out? Oh man, we're out of business. Chimps are out. What about rhesus monkeys? They're closer to us really than chimps. So Jane Goodall triumphs, but we need the rhesus monkeys. So let her keep away from the rhesus monkeys. Okay, well anyway, it turned out though that what Meany and Sumi and Ziff found is you subject these kids into different, what you can think of as versions of monkey child poverty, and you looked at the gene expression, 22% of the genes were differentially expressed. That's like almost a quarter of all the genes were differentially expressed, which is kind of amazing. And then in some joint work, Gabriella should identify herself. Put your hand up. Okay, she'll identify herself further later on in this talk. That there are these epigenetic mechanisms. And what we do is we actually make experiments, or I should say we don't. The person who does is this guy, Steve Sumi, who is actually at NIA, who has this large monkey colony. And you can actually subject the early life conditions, study these, and look at what the effects are. Not only in terms of the gene expression, but how the gene expression manifests itself in terms of diseases. You know, monkeys aren't going to be taking IQ tests, not the ones we usually take, but they are going to manifest illnesses. And we do have veterinary records. Yeah, Brent.
Actually, I was actually going to ask sort of just that. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly gene expression means?
I'll show you. Literally, we can link it to individual gene sites. But let me just show you. So here, probably, I don't know, Gabriella, you want to talk about this, or I can talk about this now. It's up to you. But I mean, I will come back to this, okay? But the point is that the rhesus monkey experiments that were actually put were various conditions where you had mothers rearing the monkeys, you had peer-reared monkeys, you had surrogate peer-reared monkeys. The latter two conditions are conditions of what? Early monkey poverty, or early family life. So it's very early in the life, and you're isolating the children. You know, at one stage in some of these monkey experiments, they raised the monkeys in complete isolation. A little bit like we put prisoners, you know, for capital crimes. I think there's a place in Colorado where people are only permitted to see somebody 1 hour a day or something. It's very, very limited. I think Noriega's there and a few others, the Unabomber. But and with those, the consequences of that were so drastic that a large chunk of those monkeys ended up committing crimes, like literally murdering their fellow monkeys. So things got so violent they didn't do the extreme. But you can see something in between. So what you're doing is you're looking at peers where you're taking away the mother and the attachment between the mother and the child. And then also you're looking at the structure where where the kid is basically spending, the young monkey is spending 22 days alone, 22 hours a day, and then 2 hours a day with a peer group. So it's near isolation, anyway, close to these maximum isolation.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Have you ever done this with adult monkeys and kind of showed that there really aren't much effects of these kinds of things on behavior?
Well, I'll come back to that in a second. This is the notion about resilience. And the answer is you can, it turns out, partially reverse these effects that I'm about to show you by getting people back into more normal environments. And the question is whether or not at adult ages, and I don't know the answer to that question, at very adult ages for the rhesus monkeys. Do you know? No, it's like at age 4 years. What if you isolate the monkeys and then look at the changes? There's work by Cacioppo, right, or giving people in isolation at adult ages. And he does some of this with our co-author, Cole, and finds some evidence of genetic manifestation, right? Yeah. Although I haven't, see, that's doesn't have the advantage here. This is a randomized controlled trial. So we actually have treatments and controls. The people who are in self-isolation are these are human beings, and they have, so I don't know about the monkeys. I haven't seen an analog. It's a good question. If you want to, we can set you up with doing some experiments with 4-year-old monkeys. Okay, so anyway, that's the general idea. And again, looking at the heat map, this is a paper that's now published. What you can see is that in the mother-reared versus the peer-reared settings, just taking these groups, the differential, this is a heat map, and you're going to see down-regulation and up-regulation in different parts of the genome. This is only in a small segment, too, of the monkey genome. We didn't do the whole genome here. This is, yeah, but this isn't what this shows, though. This isn't the full genome, right? Yeah, but within a subset, though. That's what I'm saying.
No, that's only those with a certain level of expression, right, in the whole genome.
Yeah, but I mean, what percentage? Still, if we did the whole genome, there'd be a big chunk that was not differentially expressed, is all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. That's true. Well, 22% is what they find. Yeah. Okay. So the point, though, is what does this mean? And now we can actually say, okay, it's known from the biology of these monkeys just how these upregulation and downregulation should translate into various health responses, immune responses, compromising immune responses, and the like. So we can actually see some manifestation at the genetic level where you're actually seeing different gene expression. So experience literally gets under the skin. There are lots and lots of these studies that are done in looking at. And then we ask, well, what does it actually measure? How important is it quantitatively? And we actually had the veterinary records. So not only do we know that the gene expression is modified, we also happen to know that the probability of developing an illness is substantially affected. So we can actually see, yeah.
Do you have any data on the relationship between what's expressed and actual behaviors?
This is it.
I mean, well, those were...
This maps into things like the immune system, for example.
Right, but I want to go all the way to, which monkeys are killing other monkeys or...
Ah,
Okay.
Yeah, because with this one, we had a pilot on the gene expression, and we had it up with another division for monkeys. Now we're going to have an division based on the genotype, gene expression, and phenotype. So we're getting a little bit.
Okay.
yeah, it's a project underway. But and then these are various other. So you can actually see a direct manifestation. See, what's missing so far in this whole literature is a very vast literature. I don't know if I put it on the reading list. Eva Jablonka has this large study that she has written a summary. She's she's at Tel Aviv University. She's done a tremendous amount of work on this whole issue of epigenetics. See, what this runs in the face of is the notion that, wait a minute, environments are affecting gene expression. We think of genes as something that's kind of resistant to all. And what turns out to be is there turns out to be a kind of heritability through the second and the third generation. That it turns out that the expression, that the environmental experience of the grandmother has a direct effect on the gene expression of the grandchild. And that's actually an investigation. That sounds like it violates all the basic rules of genetics, but it's not a DNA organized influence. It's and RNA influenced. Okay, so that's it. So early life experiences here I show you dramatically, and I'll show you some other evidence. And I'm not going to deal only with monkeys. I'm going to write down some models, but don't. So it's at least there's a lot of work on mice, monkeys, and other organisms, pigs, and so forth. So, but the real question, and this is what's central to the literature, people have found that early life conditions matter. And there are studies that were done of people living in poverty in suburbs of Buenos Aires, for example, and in some slums in Brazil, where you actually can see that the children there are developing. And you can see sometimes genetic tracks, and you can also see, in the sense of the brain development, some substantial early experience effects. There's a huge literature showing that early experience matters. But the key question from the point of view of economics and social policy is to what extent is there resilience, right? Question, yes?
So for the early condition here, you mean like for 3 or 4, for later life, like
Well, these are monkey years now. We're like 3 or 4 months. I mean, there is kind of an amplification factor when we get to human species, right? But yeah.
it's comparable to human being life. I'm wondering for adolescents, do we include them into early conditions or later life?
I don't know if we know of adolescent type. It's kind of a repeat of the same question, right?
Yeah. The thing important about adolescence is that that's a very important number of plasticity in the sense of the changes that you see in early life. That's another like window where you can see these changes. And so what really matters is that in terms of interventions, if you do intervene early, it looks for some traits, depending if you have to live in adolescence, or if it's related to show some evidence, you can reverse the effects of early life diversity during that period.
Yeah, there is some flexibility. See, but that's the question. If you go back to the notion that there are multiple capabilities, I'm getting ahead of the story, but yes, it turns out you can partially reverse, both through pharmacological interventions, right? And also through experience. Like literally, when you take some of these monkeys and put them back in with peers at a certain age, you can undo you can actually demethylate. You can actually revert back to what a normal pattern would be of normal experience. And that's the open question, as to what extent can we compensate? So it's not just that early life conditions. I mean, early life conditions are followed usually by a whole series of other conditions which are frequently very highly correlated. You grow up in poverty, you go to bad schools, you go through. To what extent can later schooling actually compensate for these other conditions? That's going to be a major theme. And then linking that to the notion of multiple abilities, how are we going to be able to say for what abilities and at what stages can we gain flexibility? That's kind of the key question. So there's evidence of resilience, and there's a whole literature in psychology and the biology on resilience. There was a fantastic book written by an anthropologist called Children of Kauai. Does anybody know the book, Children of Kauai? It's a group of anthropologists, really an ethnographic study. A bunch of children growing up in the very, very poor neighborhoods in Hawaii, very disadvantaged neighborhoods, very disadvantaged conditions. And so if you looked at this kind of early life determinism and took it quite seriously, the notion is most of these kids would be disasters, criminals, and so they weren't. The vast majority were actually highly successful, or not. I mean, they weren't billionaires, but they were normal, functioning middle-class people. There was regression back to the mean. And so that's the question as to whether or not to the extent to it. So we typically think about the pathologies. We think, yeah, there are high correlations. But as I keep emphasizing, the R-squares on these things typically are quite low. And there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of resilience. But through what mechanisms? So the central question is, what's the cost of remediation? And what do we know about life cycle experience? So let me show you this one graph, which I'm going to put up repeatedly. It's going to introduces the notation that I already talked about with the typographical error here. There should be T subscripts. Sorry about that. But think about the life cycle of a person. And though this is just a schematic right now, but I'm going to show you some econometric estimates of this schematic, which helps us understand something about the treatment effects that are gotten in the literature, and also about the structure of remediation. So we can just see there's like a production function. And this is what I'm going to call, in previous work with Flavio Cunha, the technology of skill formation, where the capabilities of an agent at time t plus 1 are going to be an age-dependent or stage-dependent function of the capabilities of the previous period, investment in that period, and parental traits at that period. And we could also put in government investment, this QT. To keep the diagram from being totally congested, I dropped that. But literally, we can imagine that before birth, even at the conditions when you're talking about a child starting out early in life, the initial conditions, the activities of the mother play a huge role in shaping these initial conditions. So for example, if you go to some of the Indian reservations in Manitoba, you can actually find that alcoholism is a very serious issue. So you see something like fetal alcohol syndrome, where the children grow up, start out life with very serious impairments in terms of IQ and in terms of other ingredients. Some of the work we're doing in China, for example, also in the rural area, you see substantial impairments at birth in terms of iron. There'll be substantial reductions, literally, in the poor rural areas of China and in many other parts of the world. You'll get severe iron deficiencies, which have been shown to map directly into impairments in IQ that, with current technology, is very hard to remediate. So we have a sequence of stages. That's what I'm really going to formalize this whole idea. Early life conditions, even before the birth of the child at conception, and then going through each of the stages. So the question then becomes, okay, we say, yeah, there's an effect of some investment activity, some environmental effect way into adulthood, say the Chinese famine, some insult, a typhoon, a hurricane here, cyclone there, or whatever. But the question is, what were the intermediate steps, the inputs? I mean, it's an obvious thing for an economist to ask, and we're still in the process of really rounding this out. And I'll show you what we know, but there are a lot of gaps. So here we can think, yeah, we're going to have a model in which we imagine individuals making investments. The government could be there as well in the sense of providing public goods, public opportunities, and the parental environment is there, not just in terms of giving investments, but also in terms of just providing something like a public good. And then these feed into each other and through this technology. And the question really becomes, how substitutable is it going to be between investments at one stage and endowments at another age? That's the empirical question. And I'm going to show you that. But this is the diagram to keep in mind. So when you look at monkeys, you look at we realize we have a dynamic process, and it hasn't been fully estimated, but I'll show you some estimates. Second point I want to make is that there's a large and growing literature about credit constraints. One of the leaders of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Markets Group is Lance Lochner, and he has a very nice paper in the Annual Reviews of Economics published last year about credit constraints in education. And what we've actually found, if we look at, for example, in particular education, that there is evidence that family income matters. But if it matters, it's typically that it matters most in the early years. That when income is low in their child's early years, it seems to have the maximum effect in terms of credit market constraint. This is the point I already referred to, that once you control for ability at age 18, that it turns out that gaps in schooling by racial and ethnic groups actually reverse sign in the US. So today, right now, if you were to ask what's the probability, conditioning on the ability that a person has at age 17 or 18, what is the probability that a person would go to college? Hispanics and African American are more likely to go to college than whites at the same level of ability. That's partly a manifestation of affirmative action. And the key result that's come out of this literature, and this is still true, even though people who are enthusiastic about the family income constraint literature will sometimes argue otherwise. If you look at Lochner and Monge, the paper they have in the Annual Review, that family income in the adolescent years is playing only a fairly small role. Tuition matters. I mean, there's a price of tuition. So people get confused about credit constraints and tuition. I have a credit constraint. I don't have an S500 Mercedes. But is it the credit constraint or just the price? I mean, in some sense, you say, well, these two really come to the same thing. But the structure is really different. I mean, we're thinking about a price where you might borrow in the market versus an income constraint. And it's really, the evidence of family income is quite limited. And so family income in the early years is the important aspect of the constraint. So this is a finding. What we've also come to understand, and this is part of the excitement in this literature, is that if we enrich early environments, although I haven't fully defined them yet, that it seems like various enrichments have a huge effect in terms of promoting the disadvantage, or promoting, remediating early disadvantage. So we can compensate in part by providing. But an interesting finding in this literature is that the main intervention channel is through social-emotional skills, these so-called non-cognitive skills. And in some cases, it's the only channel. So I'll show you some evidence on the Perry preschool study as well. But I first of all want to get to a model. But let me just show you a dramatic piece of evidence, of which I could give you hundreds of such graphs. But this is one that's particularly dramatic, so I'll stay with it. What we see here is ability gaps cross-classified by children's parental education of the children. We actually have longitudinal data in which we follow these kids over a period. Actually, we're following them now into their 30s, but this is early 20s, sorry, mid-20s in this particular data set. But what you're seeing is the following. You get a standard pattern, which you find in a lot of the cross-section relationships, that parents, if the mother's highly educated, like a college graduate, the test score of the kid tends to be very high. Now, test scores are arbitrary objects, right? I mean, any monotone transform of a test score is still a test score, so there's nothing particularly exciting about a test score. But you'll notice there's a parallelism here. No matter what I do, I'm still going to get this parallelism, right? And that's the amazing thing, that the gap that's there at 18, that turns out to be very predictive, not exclusively predictive, of who goes to college, that gap is there at age 5, before kids are entering school. They're mostly there by age 3. And you'll notice something else that's interesting, is that these curves are more or less parallel. And the reason why that's interesting, of course, is that across, these kids are going to very different schools, they're operating in very different environments. So if you look at something that's like an achievement test score, normalized but standardized by age, of course, but what you're finding is that these ranks tend to stay stable. And they're there, those gaps that are there at the beginning are there at, quote, the end, when the kids are about to go to college. And there are lots of other graphs which I could direct you to, the paper I wrote with Pedro, and then some work with Flavio. And if you look at measures of what are called antisocial scores, so a high score here is a bad thing, is unlike the previous graph. The high score here is associated with lowest income quartile, and the low score, which is a good thing, is associated with the highest income quartile. A more limited range, but between 4 to 12, you're getting this pattern of parallelism, near parallelism. And that's true in a lot of graphs. It's not just 2 studies I picked at random. So what you're getting is kind of the early emergence of gaps, and they're very important. Now, another matter, which is more of an empirical matter, is the gaps in capabilities have counterparts in gaps in family investments. I mean, this is not surprising in some sense, but the question is, what's the role of families and environments? So if you see a graph like this, many people would say, of course I know what this is. Remember my E0 E1 process? This is just genetics. It's just saying that lambda is pretty big, and that dumb kids have dumb parents. And dumb parents don't go to school. So this is just a genetic determination. And I'm not going to argue that genes aren't important, but I also want to argue that they are quite not the whole story. And I want to just show you, we've studied a lot, this whole collective literature, that family environments are very different, and that these environments seem to matter. And I showed you this graph already this morning, so I can skip through it. But in the United States in particular, you see a dramatic change, that family environments, especially we asking the kids under 18 living with a single parent and never having had the father, it's typically the father in the household, we see a huge growth. That's the growth sector in single parenting. And it's that sector which has been most actively investigated, among others by Young Moon. I'll show you some figures a little bit later on this. So what are these counterparts? A little bit later is right now. Here's Young Moon. So Moon, stand up. Absolutely, yeah, please. No, I don't want to just drone on, so danger.
Looking at the second of your parallel lines graphs.
This graph here, this one here, the behavioral one, yes.
Looking at that, maybe not so much looking at the previous one, which was cognitive test scores.
This is measures of aggression.
How do we separate incentives from actual capacities? So
Oh, good question.
These kids are equally capable of behaving well, but
Yes.
some of them are in classes that you're just not rewarded for behaving well.
You're raising a very, I have another whole set of lectures if you want, but I have a handout that I posted. No, it's a non-trivial question about psychological measurements. There's a huge incentive issue here. It's a huge incentive issue as to how these things are measured. Like the example I like to give, it's not quite your example, but the one that's most dramatic is the experiments that were done 40 years ago on IQ scores. You've heard about these studies, right? Well, it's a well-established finding that literally the black-white gap in IQ some 30, 40 years ago was typically one standard deviation, 15 points on an IQ test. People then did some studies. They did some experiments. And they took kids. These were all, a range of kids, but including large numbers of disadvantaged African-American kids. And for that one IQ test that they gave, they actually gave one M&M for each correct answer. That was the incentive. So they incentivized the test. There's a very large literature. And shrunk the gap almost to zero. There's actually in this other paper I have with Matilda Almond and Tim Couts and Angela Duckworth, we actually summarize a lot of those studies in a previous paper also with Borgens. And in fact, to go even further with that, Borgens has some work of his own that shows that who's most responsive to the incentives. Kids who are less conscientious, kids who are less motivated. So probably most of you have been highly motivated to take maximum scores on tests, but not everybody is. And so literally the elasticity of supply, the response to the incentivization depends a lot on these non-cognitive traits. So what does all that mean? It means that things like this and many of the other psychological measures are fundamentally contaminated. And we have some work actually looking at things like achievement tests. Even people now, in the literature, there's this huge confusion between achievement tests and IQ tests. Those are very different. They're very different. Even though people use them, psychologists use them, that's what makes it bad. We have this division of authority saying, okay, they know what they're talking about, I'm going to use their measure. But they put together something like an SAT and a pure Ravens test and a bunch of tests which are not really capturing the same thing. Achievement tests are really designed to test knowledge, acquired knowledge. And so literally the IQ contributes to an achievement test, but a lot of these social and emotional traits also contribute to the achievement test scores. Close to 30 or 40% of the variance of an achievement test score is actually produced by these personality factors.
But not just that, also incentives.
Yeah, well, you have to standardize for the incentives in administering these. And I can say honestly in the literature, except for the M&M test and a few other controlled tests, there haven't been that many cases where people have looked at the incentives. We know, for example, in reports, kind of indirectly, some notion that incentives are important. Self-reports on these things, these measures, tend to be not so reliable. Teacher reports tend to be more reliable. Parental reports, not at all reliable, especially for little kids. Because everybody thinks, here's my little Johnny or Sally, and this is my ideal kid, no matter what, however rotten it is. They just don't have they have incentives. They see that as partly judging how they're parented. I don't know what the actual theory is. But the point is that each of these scores has to be incentivized. It is incentivized and has to be standardized for the incentives and the other traits in the situation. So I can talk a bit about that if you want. I can talk about it now. But let me get to the main theme and come back. I'd love to talk about it because that's a huge question. We take these psychological measures as given, and they're not given. They're actually fundamentally determined by incentives. See, there's an extreme version of this. We're here in the same building with Richard Thaler, so I can't help but bring him into this story. Because a pure form, Thaler is a very prominent, important behavioral economist. But a big debate in psychology is between the so-called old Michelian view and the current view. So the one view is that all these traits, there's nothing stable in the trait. That the traits themselves are completely situationally determined by incentives in a situation. And there's a very large literature, which we summarize and contribute to a little bit anyway, but also summarize, which is showing high level of stability across the traits. I mean, the most famous example is by the author of the influential critique that there were no traits. So Michel, right? So Walter Michel wrote this classic book in the 1960s. If you ever mention Walter Michel's name to a personality psychologist, you'll get various gradations of hatred, extreme dislike, and so they call it the dark ages of personality psychology in the 70s and 80s. It's kind of like, the Visigoths were rumbling over Rome, and we were slowly losing all form of life, and gradually the field reassembled. But Michel claimed to find, and it's interesting if you read the original critique, what was his critique? That the correlation, not the R squared, the correlation between personality traits and measures of outcomes that he had was 0.3, R squared of 0.09. He said that's too weak. That's a very high correlation, a very high effect size for anything in psychology, and it's true also for IQ. Of course, the irony with Michel is he's the very same person who did the marshmallow test. So even though there's no stable trait, sure enough, once he found the same kids who could resist a marshmallow were also the ones who graduated college, were much less likely to commit crime, and so forth. So that's the trait debate, the trait issue versus situation issue. For me, as an economist and for an outside observer, I see the passion with which it's held. But it's just an obvious thing, right? We have a set of traits, and then we have incentives to manifest those traits, and the traits themselves can evolve. So I'm going to talk about the dynamics of these, but they're also incentives. So we have to standardize for incentives and measurement. And that's a fairly new point, I think, in psychology, but it's something I think economists would accept. So yes, that's a long-winded answer, and I could go further, but I should stop. Okay, so the question is, what's the gene? So here's some Seung. So here we have data on which we can actually look at cognitive stimulation, how much parents are reading to their children and so forth. And so if we look at these never married versus intact families, broken and blended families, what we find is some substantial differences. That never married single moms, the big growth sector in the US, are actually showing fewer resources. And we look at various kinds of emotional support and so forth. And you see huge differences across ethnic groups and so forth. So let me just leave that as it stands. Seung, do you want to say anything? No? Okay, fine. So in other words, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it's there. But now this is an interesting question. And this is a question that's receiving a lot of recent attention. The question then is, why is it that some people are getting more early life stimulation than others? And what are the important consequences? And here I'm looking at, so there's a question about information. There's a large literature. There are a bunch of innovations now where what's happening is that people are actually now finding that telling the indigenous people in Manitoba, or telling high school dropout girls who are having their first child, they're 13, 14 years of age, things like it's not good to drink and smoke when you carry a kid, that has an effect. That's literally not information they know. So there's a real question, and Flavio Cunha, so the question of parental ignorance is really substantial. Not just ignorance about the child, but the best way about child rearing practices. The most extreme example I had was a visit I had in Montreal a few years ago, where there was a Canadian policy at one point to get rid of all influence of the family on the next generation of indigenous people. So they put the kids in orphanages. So the question is, how do you teach people who've never had a parent how to parent? So there really was extreme ignorance in that case. But it turns out, and Flavio Cunha at Penn has a series of studies, some with eliciting the amount of information that individuals have about expectations. There's this ethnographic work by anthropologist LaRue that also shows substantial differences. So it's consistent. So this question about the information of the technology, you may not know what the best practice is. And secondly, you may not know the child. You may not actually monitor the child all that closely. There are different styles. And then, of course, we can ask the question, is it also the expectations that parents have of the child? There's a very large literature saying, well, that certain groups, certain individuals, and certain subgroups within groups, certain individuals within groups have low expectations for their children. The fact of the matter is, right now, I can't give you a hard empirical assessment of what percentage of these. It's an open research question. I will show you a little bit about what I think is the issue on credit constraints. But right now, the way the literature plays out, we're not exactly sure why those resource endowments are really so different. We say, well, people are poor, they have fewer resources, it should make a difference. And yet there are plenty of stories, as I said earlier, where people actually went right back from extreme poverty and extreme deprivation to real, at least middle class success. Here's an example from an earlier literature. I got to start laying out the model soon here, but there's a paper by Hart and Risley, which was famous in this literature, where Hart and Risley interviewed 3 groups of families, some on welfare, some more working class, some professionals. This was all in Kansas. So these are all like in Lawrence, Kansas. I don't know how serious these differences are, but Hart and Risley, these 2 authors, found substantial differences in the quantity of words heard in a typical hour. So the kids on welfare were actually getting 600 words an hour. The kids who were living in professional families had 3 to 4 times more. And also more important is that the parenting styles fundamentally different. Many more affirmatives a lot more contact at the professional level, but also many more prohibitions. Don't do this, don't do that. And that, again, seems to have a real effect. So that when you looked at the cumulative vocabulary, even before my graph, I started at 3, so this is before, up to the graph, you're finding that the vocabulary of the kids dramatically differed, 500 versus 1,100 words. So this has been one of the arguments that people have made about why environments matter. And so LaRue has a series of studies, and I'll let you take a look at these. They're consistent with everything I said, but I'm going to... Okay, so what else do we know? So yes, abilities are multiple. In both human and animal species, there's compelling evidence of critical and sensitive periods. Early life conditions are not the full story. But what we also know is that many adolescent programs that are targeting disadvantaged children, at least as they're currently configured, aren't that effective. Although I want to really come back to that. There is a pattern here that many later, and this is like a disequalizing nature of interventions, that you get very high returns later in life for the more able people. I've estimated returns, for example, for highly motivated, very able college students to be in the range of 20-25% per annum. Huge returns for the very top end of the ability distribution, much lower returns for the less able. And the question is, well, what do you make of that? That by itself suggests a form of social Darwinism, right? You say the most disadvantaged kids, well, we've lost them and there's nothing we can do about them. The question is, how important is that and what can we do? And I want to advertise what's to come, that some of the programs that are actually working on non-cognitive socio-emotional skills turn out to be more effective. And that has to do with both the biology and the economics that we know that some of these skills, some of these traits are basically evolving, and that they're evolving in ways that suggest greater malleability for social emotional skills than for cognitive skills. In fact, this model that I set out before is actually very simplistic, because actually the traits that are characteristic of individual behaviors enrich. So we think about the dimension of that theta vector, it's actually expanding. You're actually getting more traits. So kids have more complex personalities. Little kids at age 3 and 4 don't have the same strategies, the same capacities to deceive, to enjoy, to enlighten, and so forth as older kids. And so there really is a sense in which we are finding that the stability of these so-called non-cognitive traits is substantially less than that of cognitive traits. One of the findings in the literature is near rank stability of things like IQ at age 10, by age 10 to 13. It's not perfect. It's not saying you can't get smarter, although I want to separate achievement test smart from IQ test smart. But certainly for these non-cognitive skills, there's a lot of evolution going on. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the neuroscientists are producing about these, literally the prefrontal cortex is slowly evolving. It's maturing until the early 20s. And so certain aspects of judgment, decision making, which I think are related to these non-cognitive traits very strongly, have been shown to be, are actually emerging at later ages. And so there's more margin of flexibility there. So there are still, and this may sound like I'm contradicting myself, the empirical literature shows high economic returns for remedial investments in young disadvantaged children. So early on, there seem to be fairly high returns in disadvantaged children, somewhat less so in later life. And this is a graph which is a purely theoretical graph, and it's not an equilibrium proposition. It's a proposition that's saying, what's the rate of return? If I imagine starting at the beginning of life and asking what's the marginal increment to what's the marginal benefit from the earliest years to the later years, you're finding successive increments, decrements, in terms of rates of return. Why? Because built into the early return is the capacity to create higher capital stocks down the line, which make later period investment productive. So I don't know if that's clear. I'll show you more formally what's going on. But literally what you're doing is you're building the skill base early on, and that's why the return's so high. It's a direct payoff plus the fact that you're able to build a stock which makes the later investments highly productive. But that's a theoretical proposition. We know that in equilibrium, assuming there's, quote, perfect capital markets, say under certainty, we should get the rate of return to investment, if we properly measure it, equal to the interest rate. And that would be true across all ages. Okay, so we also know that from some literature claims that investment in disadvantaged children, if not followed up, its effect at later ages is lessened. And then the effects of credit constraints, well, I already said this about early years. So, and these other points I made, parental knowledge is less well developed, social and emotional skills are important, early life factors play an important role. And the last point I do want to emphasize is that multiple treatment effects reported in the literature have well-established causal bases. So we actually have a lot of experiments, both natural and man-made experiments, but the idea of what's going on, what the mechanism is, isn't that well established. So I would argue the literature is long on treatment effects and short on understanding mechanisms, and I want to talk a little bit about it. So let me just summarize very briefly a series of models that I did with Flavio Cunha and some updated versions of this. So what we imagine is a very simple framework, abstract from a lot of important features. So it's like many models, it's way too simple, but at least gets to certain aspects that lets me explain the features of what's going on in these data. So I have one-child families, but we have multiple periods as adults and children. You'll notice in that original model that I put up, the one that Solon had, a lot of the model that generates it, all of childhood, all of adulthood is one period. But we know that given this developmental work that I just talked about, there's tremendous variation among, that there are really constraints and there are different evolutions. There are life cycle phenomena. And the important thing is we think, and there's evidence for critical and sensitive periods, periods where investment's particularly productive in the life cycle. So I'm going to allow for that and consider what the implications are. Then there's parental altruism, which is what we saw before. But then parents have different constraints. So there's already the accident of birth, which we talked about, and Steve talked about already. But in addition, which was already in the Becker-Tomes model and Solon's model and so forth, is the inability of the family to borrow against the future income of the child. So you can't transfer across generations. That's the assumption. So even if your child is a genius, you can't borrow against it. But also, if we think of the multi-period framework, we think of life cycle credit constraints. And there's a very big literature in terms of the consumption income literature showing that credit constraints, if any time important, would be typically earlier in the life cycle of an individual. So let me lay out a very simple framework that captures at least some features of this. And the features would be, abilities created. So it's not going to talk too much about genetics yet. It talks about the emergence of ability gaps. It relates it to family investments. Talks about critical and sensitive periods. Why later life interventions may not be as effective. Why there are high returns for investing early life disadvantaged children. And why early investment should be followed by later investment. So it captures some empirically important ideas. So any questions about the general framework? I want to build a very simple model now. Any questions about the structure of the? Yes?
I recall from the framework that you showed at the beginning that there were the traits of the parents that basically kind of update in each period after the way in which I interpreted the notation. Update after having observed the level of ability of the child and the investment.
Yes.
This kind of dynamics is also present.
Yes, I'll show you. But it's in a very simplified form. Then I'll show you some other more elaborate versions. But let me get to the essence of it, and then, that's here. Oh, yes, please.
Is the algorithm of the parents so different than any? Are there differences in the algorithms of the parents?
The algorithms?
Yeah.
You mean preferences?
Yeah.
There could be.
Which drive the investment into children?
Absolutely. The altruism could vary tremendously. We know we have abusive families. So that delta that I had up in the Solon model, it'll reappear here, a version of it, could vary and would vary. In fact, some parents are very altruistic, some are not. Some may be more constrained than others. Some may have higher ability levels. All features of that will be part of what I'm going to describe, but not the full story. It's only one-child families. You could say that smart parents or wealthy parents might have more kids, might have fewer kids, quantity-quality trade-off. So anyway, the idea, though, is we have an overlapping generations model, and each generation lives two periods. It's going to cap T here, but T is going to become 2 real fast, so I might as well get to it. And so what we're doing is we have like 2 periods as a child, 2 periods as an adult, and then the individual dies at the end of that period, right into in the final period, just before her child's child is born. So that's what's going on here in terms of the structure. And again, there's altruism. And this is the notation I used before, but it's just simply saying now I got rid of this peculiar functional form assumptions. There's no reason to assume that investment is perfectly offset or perfect substitute for government investment. Could be positive, negative. There's self-productivity in the sense that human capital of the child, G is still the child. G minus 1 is the parent in this case. These are governmental investments. And these are shocks, so that's going to play the same role as that chi, but it's going to be more general. And here I'm going to just normalize everything so that this is an increasing function. So we have an initial condition and depends on parental investment and parental human capital. Okay? So the key role, it's like you might imagine, is going to be the role of complementarity and substitutability. How important empirically is complementarity? And what do we mean by complementarity here? Well, the question will be how much the parent's initial endowment, that should be an HT plus 1 up there in the numerator, sorry. How much the human capital up here, subscript. But so the question is really the following. We already have a multi-period framework. How easily can we substitute by future investment for some stock early on? How much can we substitute for parental quality? So the whole story, without, obviously we know complementarity and substitutability. This is in a direct sense, right? Look at the production functions. The question is how important are these is going to play a huge role. So let me just lay out a framework. So 2 periods, 2 periods in the childhood, 2 periods of adulthood, W is going to be the wage rate, R the interest rate, and we're going to draw some initial endowment of the child. It's going to be theta naught G. And that can be influenced through investment, but I'm going to leave that kind of silent in this simple model. So the idea is the following. There will be intergenerational transmission. There will be credit markets, and on reaching adulthood, parents can receive the bequest. They receive a bequest from their parents. And so they have their own human capital skills, their own financial resources. So this is now under perfect certainty in the sense that we get WH 1 plus R. There could be some uncertainty about the future generations' stability, but the constraint has to be respected, which is basically you can either consume or invest in your child. Okay? So that's going to be the budget constraint, and R is going to be, so the parental choice variables are C2, I2, and then the amount of bequest they leave to their own child. Okay? Very simple model, just stripped down. Okay? And now we allow for a beta, which is going to be the standard discount factor. And here we have this delta here, which is the parental altruism. And there might be uncertainty about the endowment of the child. That's the major source of uncertainty. And the problem with the parent, so the child is basically assumed only to be a source of pleasure in realization in adult life. But there's no direct consumption of the child. You're not admiring the kid in the playground. The kid isn't having any happiness. This is a life of total investment activity, going to school or whatever. And then finally the kid springs out, becomes an adult, and the parents value the future value function of the child. So it's a very, very stylized model. There's a lot more you could do with it. But what I want to do is kind of focus on this key case of complementarity substitution, which is really central to the literature. And that's what I want to. So let me take the simplest case where we can solve out recursively from the technology to come up with what the adult stock of human capital would be, the child's adult stock of skills, H prime, as a function of its endowment, its parents' endowment. There's no further investment once you're an adult. And then the investment in the first period and the investment in the second period. So 9, this equation 9, is coming directly from just solving out, where did I stick this production function? My production function's been hidden. Some version of this production function. But you can see how I get it. Just repeated substitution, and that's going to give me this technology. So that already embodies a lot of different ideas, by the way. But let me just say the previous model that I put up, the Solon, Becker, Tomes, one-period childhood model, is basically a version of this where literally investments in the first and second period are perfect substitutes. Literally gamma is equal to a half. There's no reason to favor them. So that's one model, perfect substitution. So early versus late investment makes no difference whatsoever. That's kind of the standard model. And obviously, if we start with perfect substitutes, the polar opposite in this kind of framework is going to be perfect complements. And I want to argue that a lot of the evidence is actually supporting much more perfect complements than perfect substitutes. So the question is so what's the measure of substitution? But let me just stay with this simple example and develop it quickly. Obviously, we can do a more general version and write like a CES and say, okay. And there are explicit examples in the literature. We can derive equation 12 from more primitive equations, but let me just leave it at this. And we can think of gamma here in this context as being a skill multiplier. It's literally being how much the skill affects it's like a share parameter in a CES. It is a share parameter in a CES. And it's basically a skill multiplier, how productive investment is. Remember, I've solved out recursively this technology. So it's the effective investment in raising the stock, and then the effective investment in boosting the productivity of investment next period. That's the multiplier. So it's two effects, right? The direct effect and then the effect through raising the productivity. Okay. So the obvious intuition here, just to kind of get your intuition moving, if it hasn't moved already, is basically, well, suppose you have perfect substitutes. And so you want to ask the question, what do we know as economists? Well, there's always the time force of discounting. And so if everything else is the same, we're back to the simplified model of perfect substitutes, the Solon-Becker version of this model, say, then Becker-Tomes version of the model, then we're basically going to say, oh, we should always delay, right? Unless this productivity parameter, gamma, is sufficiently high. So in other words, everything else the same, if I can get the same bang, do it later rather than early, and I can delay it, I'm going to have more to do when I do it later, so therefore I should delay. So the question is, what's the relative productivity? This is the relative productivity in this CES case. This is this notion gamma here where phi is equal to 1, so it's perfect substitutes. So yeah, I could have a case where I'd invest early, but it depends on how productive this gamma is, how high gamma is relative to R. But we can take the general CES case for these preference functions and come up with a notion of what the relative investment is. And the relative investment then consists of, so if we ask how much do we invest in the first period relative to the second period, what we end up with is something that depends on the interest rate, the gamma parameter, this productivity, this multiplier effect, as well as this elasticity of substitution between current and future investments, period 1 and period 2 investments. So here's an example, just drawn some examples, make it very simple, assuming get rid of my time preference example, get rid of the discounting from the capital market, and so everything is just going to be the skill multiplier. And so the Leontief case, in the case where I have equal shares here, is going to be basically a 1-for-1. Invest early, invest late. If I have a perfect substitute case, then it would be like a step function. And we can see a series of different, the benchmark case might be Cobb-Douglas. So what this is saying is, depending on the level of gamma, this is going to be the bias. How much multiplier effect do I get, early versus late? Higher the value of gamma, the higher I1 relative to I2. So that's the structure that you get. Okay, so that's all very simple, and that already starts to help us think about how to get rid of this, how to extend this. So clearly, in a complete markets model, the optimal investment levels don't depend on the parent's permanent shocks or wages. But you'll notice that still, even in this model, even in this very, very simple model, that even if I have no borrowing constraint, precisely because if you look at this parental H, that you're still going to find that this H parameter is playing a role in shaping the optimal amount of investment. Simply, some environments are richer environments and have higher returns and will affect then the optimal early versus late trade-off. Okay, so suppose we have a constraint, and this is the kind of constraint that was considered in the literature where you can't borrow against future income. So we get a very simple constraint that B prime is greater than or equal to 0. So you can't leave debts to your kids, but you can leave a bequest, a positive bequest. So suppose we add that constraint. What do we find in this? Well, if you think about it, the constraint is really a constraint across generations. It's not going to be a constraint within generations. And what that means is it's not going to affect the relative amount of investment first period versus second period. It can affect the absolute levels, right? But it's a constraint across generations, has no consequence intergenerational. So that kind of credit constraint is obviously not going to change the ratio of investments I1 to I2. But now if we consider something which is not in the literature, or wasn't in the literature until we wrote on this, is the following. Parents are subject to lifetime liquidity constraints themselves. And let me suppose that the parent's productivity grows at a rate alpha. And the parents themselves may or may not be constrained. But let me consider the case of constraint. So again, if we think of parental savings now, a new variable that we introduce here in this model, then clearly consumption and investment and the amount of savings. You can have non-negative savings. That's the restriction. So if you're constrained, if this constraint is binding, so you get 2 period constraints, first period, second period, and here's my assumption that wages are growing at a rate alpha. That captures the idea that younger parents generally face a rising wage profile, rising income profile. That's been found in a lot of the literature. due to work experience effects and also some other kinds of human capital investments. But let me just take it as an exogenous parameter. Then we get these two constraints. And now, obviously, we can see we get a very different kind of story. Or we may get a different kind of story if these constraints bind. So if I just write down, for a very simple power utility model, hope the notation is reasonably clear here. This is just my parental preference function. It's going to be a power utility. So I know I've used lambda now for multiple things. This is no longer the heritability parameter. It has to do with this parameter of the power utility parameter, risk aversion parameter. But what you see is we acquire exactly the same investment ratio as we had before, plus a term that's less than or equal to 1 if the constraint is binding. So what we find then, and this is just rewriting what the constraint is. So if the constraint's binding, then what we're going to typically find is, because of this constraint, less investment in the early years and the later years. But the strength of that constraint will depend on the strength of lambda relative to phi. Two different issues here, right? One is the question of how much can I substitute intertemporally in consumption? And the second is how much can I intertemporally substitute in investment? And so if I'm in the situation, for example, where I have lambda equal to 1 and say phi not equal to 1, so I avoid avoid some degeneracies here, then basically I'm going to be in a situation where this term is irrelevant, and I'm back to the previous model. Because what happens is that parents are substituting. They can substitute perfectly. Now, there's still an implicit feasibility consideration here, but that's kind of the essence of what's going on. So then it's a tug of war between this. And if you look at the data in the literature, we have a paper, Cunha and Chanak and I have this paper published now 3 years ago, suggesting that this phi parameter is of the order of magnitude of -2. And some work by Atanasio and Browning. We have a whole paper summarizing these parameters with Browning and Lars Hansen, that we find actually that lambda is in a range of -3 to 1.5. And so what we find is we're pretty far away from the assumption where this coefficient is exactly 0, and these constraints really would be non-trivial. And in fact, the evidence is really supporting that family resource influence is substantial on relative investment. So there's a lot of work on this, and in fact, this model is consistent with it. But you can also, I can use this as a vehicle for explaining some research. So this is explaining why early credit constraints may matter. There's some recent work by Cochran and Lochner that confirms these findings. I mentioned this paper by Monge and Lochner and Monge Naranjo. And there's also evidence consistent with the unimportance of family income. So I think this model is consistent with this, because the importance of family income, if anything, is going to be there in the years when the credit constraint in terms of family income is binding. Okay? And now, why would there be ineffectiveness of adolescent interventions? Well, if we imagine starting to intervene in a situation where we're closer to the complementarity versus substitution story, once I've built the skill base, the productivity of investment in the adolescent years can be quite low, even though it could be very high in the early years, right? Take my case of Leontief complementarity, perfect complementarity. I'm going to show you some estimates which suggest that's closer to the story, at least in the later years. So what would be then suggested would be, in the Leontief case, if you're in the min of I1, I2, and your I1 is close to 0, your optimal is I2 equal to 0. It's not going to be efficient to invest. So that's the sense in which the skill base is fundamentally going to be affected by the structure of investment early on. And so in that sense, the skill begets skill. The notion that these early life interventions are very important is rationalized. So the question, though, is really the following, and this is where there's a lot of emerging body of empirical evidence. So I've already mentioned social Darwinism, but let me just explain a little bit more. So what I've done is I've broken out my technology, put it back in its original form, I'm going to ask the notion, well, there's one version that says you start with kids who are very disadvantaged, right? And they're inferior, quote, why not perpetuate the inferiority? If we have universal complementarity, we should just build on the advantages. From a purely socially efficient standpoint, we shouldn't worry about compensation. Because, I mean, we may, from a point of view of feel good, and we may, from some of the theories that Steve was talking about, think about these. But it could also be the case that from a purely productivity standpoint, we would find that there would be a serious trade-off between equity and efficiency. But when we come to this notion of complementarity and substitution, let me go back to this. No, go back to it. Let me introduce three different notions. First of all, there's the technology that I get in the skills in the first period, the stock of skills in the second period. So just a very simple, but I've now broken out the production functions in the first two periods. The complementarity between the initial endowment of the child and the investment could be either positive or negative. They could be substitutes or complements. And so, and you can see that we actually have at least three notions of complementarity floating around, or substitutability. We have complementarity or substitutability in the early stages. We have it in the second stage, and then we have it in this reduced form relationship. And this reduced form relationship came from my substituting this into this, right? And then coming up with this. So you can clearly see that I could get substitution between I1 and I2, even if I could get substitutes, these being good substitutes, even if F212 is positive. Okay? So in other words, the question then is an empirical question. I mean, I could write down all kinds of theories based on this, and this is kind of the simple form. But I can have complements or substitutes at each stage. But you'll notice the notion of complementarity and substitution is somewhat different at each stage. It's how much I'm substituting or able to substitute, overcome the endowment I have at each of the stages. And so the net effect, the theta 2 is a function of I1 and I2. Well, that could depend on, so I could literally have these two being perfect substitutes or being substitutes, even though in the second stage they're complements, right? It depends on these two factors, because one is, I'm just recursing one into the other function. So that's the empirical question. What are the strengths of these different substitution and complementarity relationships? Okay, I want to come to that. I don't know when we should break, or well, let me go through the limitations and then start with a measurement framework, and then talk about some more general schemes. But the limitation of the analysis is that I'm talking so far only about income inequality, and yet there are a lot of other dimensions which could be linked to human capital. So in the standard human capital literature, okay, education is human capital or is related to it, health, crime, and so forth. This framework is still focusing primarily on credit market failures, but at least gets in the sense that the family influence is important, that H was playing an important role, potentially important role, above and beyond the credit constraints. So point C is made. It's still talking only about scalar abilities. It's talking about scalar investments, and yet we think of multiple investments. And it also is thinking about this one-dimensional skill. But what I'm suggesting is an expanding vector of these skills, and that they are not only, the dimension is expanding, so we're getting multiple skills, and we're getting multiple traits, if you want, or multiple capabilities that are emerging. The model is one of efficiency units in the labor market. That's standard in this literature. But we know there's a lot of comparative advantage, so Roy-type models could be potentially important. And it's very, very difficult to interpret treatment effects and then integrating family and government policies. And that's what I want to do. So here, let me talk about capabilities, and then we can break, because this just repeats what I said earlier and builds on what Steve said, or at least a subset of what Steve was talking about. So here's the vector of capabilities. Now it's got the proper subscripts for time. Each of these could be dimensional, and the dimension of each of these thetas could be changing. That's the important thing. So again, there's a whole literature about how do we pick the dimension of these capabilities. We have a bunch of measurements And there are various econometric methods we have for essentially picking this dimension. I can show you some examples of that. But we have health, cognition, and non-cognitive capabilities. Those are important roles. And there are two functions that come out. This I've talked about already. But what I didn't talk about was that there's a very substantial literature about critical and sensitive periods, which typically are found to be earlier for cognitive abilities, later for non-cognitive abilities, and it varies depending on the particular biological capability gaps. So many of these things we already talked about. But at a key point, and something that I found very surprising, and the one that the literature has found very surprising, it's still the case when you're looking at the evaluation of these interventions. Many people are looking at test scores. Virtually all the educational economics literature is saying a test score has gone up, a PISA score has gone up, and governments rise or fall in Europe over this. I was recently in China. They were extremely happy that the Chinese students in Shanghai did very well on their PISA scores. But what I really want to argue is that's a serious limitation for thinking about these interventions. And it's serious because many of these evaluations only are short-term in nature. Because they're short-term in nature, these traits, these measurement focusing only on a certain dimension leads to a kind of a myopia. An example was the work that was done 40 years ago on looking at Head Start. There was a Head Start program introduced in the 1960s in the United States. And the program was more or less killed, or almost got killed in the late 60s, because people did a randomized controlled trial, and they found that, in fact, the structure of IQ of the treatment group children was more or less the same as that as a control a few years after the experiment. Arthur Jensen actually made a career of that finding. And the idea was that most of the treatment and control group children were basically African American, disadvantaged children. And so the argument was, look, there's not much we can do with these people. They're intrinsically inferior. We've just proved it. What they were looking at is one dimension of human performance, the cognitive dimension. I'm going to show you in the Perry study in a minute that actually you'd get exactly the same finding in a program which has been followed up now for 40 years with plans to follow it to 50 years, where rates of return have been estimated somewhere between 7 to 10% per annum. Again, the IQ rose, then fell, so that by age 10, the IQs of the treatment group and the control group were more or less the same. But the kids did extremely well in terms of their non-cognitive traits and in terms of reduced crime, improved health, participation in schooling, many, many, many dimensions. And so I think the idea is that we need to think more broadly. So this gets us into almost a totally different subject, which I have some handouts on, but we talked about already, which is the importance of this vector of skills, not only for measuring, but understanding the mechanisms through which these skills that are operating. And this takes us into something that sounds very touchy and feely, but actually is extremely important and actually has some hard evidence. So I'm suggesting that a lot of these early childhood interventions are operating through these non-cognitive capabilities, which are related to, but not the same as, preference parameters. So Doman and Falk have a paper in the annual review last year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago, basically showing the relationship between these non-cognitive traits and things like risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, time preference, and so forth. There's a relationship, but it's far from perfect, a very weak relationship, suggesting that these psychological measures supplement the kind of dimensions of human performance and prediction that are important for understanding real behavior. I've already talked about point 9, but I do want to introduce a state-based framework that allows me to synthesize interventions across studies, that allows me to sort of put together various pieces of this evidence. See, the danger is I run an experiment, I got this treatment effect, somebody else runs an experiment, they get that treatment effect. What are the mechanisms? What's the common finding among these different interventions? And that's really what I want to try to suggest this framework is. So what are the main ingredients? Well, like any economic model, first of all, age-specific outcome function. These are like the functionings that Steve Dorloff put up in his talk. Dynamic technologies, I've already talked about it. And then parental preferences. There's a large literature that's emerging on parental preferences. So for example, a recent paper is coming out now in the Review of Economic Studies by Daboka, Flynn, and Wiswall is showing models of parental altruism and showing particular preference parameters and their importance in shaping the choice of child investment activities. There are a lot of different styles. The one I put up from Becker and Tomes and from Solon had the utility of the income of the child as being what the parent's objective was. So there's a whole literature about what are the preferences. To me, and this is something which fascinates me, if you want to talk for a few hours on this, I'm happy to. No, but these last 2 points, if preference formation, that's what we're really talking about. We're really talking about, and this is where we get into all the philosophical issues that Steve was steering us towards, and leads to the question of, are we going to be arguing we want our kids to be a certain way? And I know, like I have this idea of I'm a third grade school teacher, and I have this conception of what a good kid should be, and maybe somebody across the street doesn't believe me or accept that. I don't want to argue that, but I do think we actually are talking about preference formation, and it's not something that's been that well researched. I mean, we have models of habit formation, an addiction that lead to that. Yeah.
But are you talking here about true economic preferences, or is this again something like non-cognitive skills?
No, but I wouldn't separate those two. See, that's what I'm saying. The Doman and Falk studies are relating those preference parameters to our traditional preference. See, I would argue that the thrust of what Doman and Falk found, I would take their analysis make a more radical statement, that this literature that's integrating personality psychology with economics is discovering other aspects. Rustaccini, too, a decision theorist at the University of Minnesota, has found similar findings, that these preference parameters, these are parameters that operate through preferences. They also operate through constraints, they operate through information, and they operate through, through a number. But certainly preference is one channel to which they operate. I haven't separated them out yet, but yeah.
Yeah, but my question was because concerning skills, mostly it's like better skills is generally better. But concerning preferences, for example, risk, there's no general direction, which means this is the better preference, or so what you just said is that.
No, I understand that I can't order and say the world should be much less risk averse. If we're only more risk taking, then we could have even more recessions or something. No, but you see, this is the delicate issue, and this is what I'll ask Steve. I'll call on Steve now to answer the question. No, but there's really a sense in which we think of certain capacities to function. That's why I'm thinking about the capacities to function. So if I enlarge your choice set, that's what I think of these capabilities. You can choose to be what you want to be. I remember once I was asked a similar question. I was lecturing at a group of people, Irish scholars, and I don't know how many people are from Ireland here. If anybody's from Ireland, does the name Brendan Behan mean anything to anybody? No? He was a very, he was a very famous poet, but he was also a drunk, notorious drunk. What's that?
Same thing.
Yeah, no, well, drunk with words, but this is drunk with alcohol. And they said, you're trying to put a template down on what our people should be. And we would never have had Brendan Behan if he had if we had had your template. There's a very fine line about exactly, is there better risk aversion? I would argue that I would argue, and I haven't proved this, I don't think anybody's proved it. I found difficulty with the Nussbaum-Sinn approach, especially Nussbaum's version, because it really did seem like a Western image of certain democracy, of how democracy should work. I had the image that they were telling us what a New England meeting house would look like around 1850 in their idealized world, and that's the way we all should be, with very temperate citizens and so forth and so on. I don't want to go that far into prescriptions of life, but I would argue that most people would accept that cognition is a good thing. I mean, I don't think many parents would say, I'd like my kid to be dumb, to be very good. Even if whatever lifestyle, and the same thing would be true about control of temper. management of one's life. So if you think about this as expanding your opportunity set in this dimension, I think there's some non-controversial aspects of enlarging opportunities in life, right? That's what I want to try to get to in the functionings. I agree with you when it comes leisure. Now, do I argue it's much better for everybody to work hard? I can't argue that. But I can argue that it's much better for people to be able to work hard if they want to. So I view that as a sense of capacity. So the same thing is true about information. See, one of the things that is one of these big 5 characteristics that turns out to be very important and associated with intelligence is openness to experience, right? So what is openness to experience? It's the ability to absorb ideas from people. So you've all known people who basically hide off in corners and refuse to interact. And there's a very famous, I think is it Melville? Bartleby? Bartleby? Isn't Bartleby? Who? Yeah, right. Does anybody, Bartleby the Scrivener, right. But, and the point of the story was that he was asked to do a number of things, and his standard answer was, I prefer not to, right? And he kind of is a little bit like, he just kind of shrivels away into nothingness. But those are psychological traits that actually impair knowledge. We think that knowledge is actually acquired by interactions. And so I would argue that somebody who is more open to experience than somebody less would be. Now, maybe that would not be a good trait for the monastic life. If you're very gregarious and you're going to become a monk in a very rigorous monastery, that may be a very bad trait. But I would say there are some traits that. But it's a non-trivial question. And you're right. When I think about preferences, we think much more. Well, do we really want everybody to be more or less risk averse? But I guess, like Steve was saying, it's like the capacity to be more or less risk averse. So it's a capacity to almost imagine yourself and to change yourself. See, I see these capabilities that Steve was talking about. If I were to rationalize sin, at least my way, I want these capabilities because it gives me the opportunity to try different lifestyles or to be different things. That's what the point is. It gives me an enlarged set. Whatever I choose is up to me. The problem with all that is that maybe we are, in fact, talking about forming preferences, which means there is no me. There's just the manifestation of what the parents brought into me. So, and that's the non-trivial question about exactly how these are formed. So the parent-child preferences, then there are models of parent-child interactions that are more standard. But this leads to something really, really basic, which unfortunately none of these models talk about. And that's the nature of the attachment relationship. That sounds like, well, I've lost my brain here, but the attachment relationship is something very well studied in psychology, thought to be known in psychology. We know what it means. It means some kind of mentoring relationship, some kind of dynamic learning. But the fact of the matter is, right now, we don't have a very clear image of exactly what the learning mechanism is between a parent and a child. We kind of have an idea, right? The parent stays with the child, there's this whole theory of learning where the parent is gradually sort of getting near where the child is, pushing the frontiers of the child, encouraging the child, and so forth. But a big part of that relationship is actually this trust and relationship framework. And I would argue that's true in preschool programs, in families, in a number of different settings. But it's that process by which we actually teach our children and interact with our children, or our adults. Generally involves, many good teachers actually act as mentors. And that is a form of an attachment relationship where people establish relationships, work with people at different levels. So there's a huge literature to be investigated here. And I would ask people, Larry Bloom, I would ask, what do we really know about preference formation? What?
Very little.
Very little, right. I think it's but I think it's a fascinating area, and ultimately we're getting near there, right? We're getting into that framework. And again, you ask, well, maybe I shouldn't call preference. Maybe I should call it capability formation. Then it sounds very good. But it's partly also this notion of, just exploring the information that I have. How do I process the world? How do I interact with the world? Anyway, I'm getting rhapsodic. So, and then parent-child interactions, the work of Canscanetti and Akibayashi, and there's a more style in huts and others. There are these notions of both child-child interactions and parent-child. So there's a very rich literature, none of which I covered with this simple model. So it's really talking about how you're forming the child. But Becker has some papers, recent papers and older papers as well. And, the idea is, well, some of the theory of the Confucian ethic was basically a scheme in part to give old age security to the parents. So what you try to do is build guilt and obligation and build a sense of expectation. And actually there is a paper written, which we can post if anybody's interested, Chinese Big Five. I mean, it's actually, what's that?
Big Seven.
Oh, the Big Seven, right. Now there's a literature whether it's Big Five, but the Big Seven, did you hear the paper in Beijing? How was it? Okay.
Stimulating would be a good word.
Stimulating, yes. But the point is that there are certain cultural values that are transmitted. And one of them was saying, okay, I want you to feel guilty about supporting me. I raised you as a little kid. There are other counterparts for this in other cultures. It's not all Chinese. Guilt is a big issue in many cultures. But the point is that creating these preferences is part of this process of parent-child. And I would argue very little about it, very mechanical. And I would argue that a lot of it has to do with this learning and attachment relationship, which is under investigation. Anyway, so we also have social influences, of which we'll hear more, and then information and constraints. Those are the more traditional. So let me just lay out the framework, and then we can take a break. The functionings, this is my formation. This is the notion that came up about incentives. So this formalizes in what we're talking about, and I'll show you some estimates of this after the break. But this is, to me, equation 17 is a key equation. And I think it's a key equation in interpreting all of the economics and psychology literature, the behavioral economics literature, and of course the economics literature too. So it's a very standard looking equation. But we have an outcome from an activity at age t, some yjt. I would give you examples. It could include my IQ test in my previous example. It could include my achievement test. It could include my labor supply, how productive I am in the structure of say, working in a factory floor. So that would depend on the stock of capabilities that I have at a given age. So if I'm smart, I can do really well. Y is like producing mathematical theorems. Suppose I'm a string theorist and I'm asking, well, how well can I do string theory? Well, if I'm really smart and good in mathematics in particular, I'm pretty good. Non-cognitive traits. You might want the ability not to socialize, to focus, like the Fermat's last theorem guy, right, who locked himself in his attic for 10 years. I don't think he was too gregarious. He wasn't hanging out at the Princeton Inn, having beers with the undergraduates. He was basically working through equations. And then he had to be in pretty good health. Otherwise, he would have died in the process. So there are these, and each of these, we ask about, so even though this sounds kind of ridiculous, it's trivial. It's really important that we standardize for these traits and understanding. So whether it's a test score or some output of a task, it's the same basic type of equation. And E is the effort we apply to the equation. This is the Borgen's work that I was talking about before. And effort depends on incentives and on other social factors. So you can have a social presence. So for example, we could say, who commits crime? Well, if AT as part of your environment is police, and you have police patrol, you're going to have much less crime. If you are in the lab versus in the field, you're going to be observed. Yeah, you're going to find different efforts and different responses. And then X would just be goods inputs that affect functioning. So I think the goods input is part of the structure that Sen was focusing on. And I would think about the capabilities as being the inputs for what these functionings are. So at this level, if I think of my capacity, it's my capacity to do things. Now, the trouble is, a YJT could also be my capacity to destroy humanity, I guess. I could make this very negative. And I could ask from a social standpoint, maybe, so I can push a button and destroy millions of people. Maybe not such a good thing, but within a range. And this is what Larry Bloom was getting at. There has to be kind of some restriction here when we think about these at least as positives. Although there's no reason why they have to be positives. I could be very conscientious, a mastermind of the mafia. I could, as a criminal mind, highly conscientious, highly organized, very intelligent, being able to devote lots of effort to my criminal activity, and being able to hire lots of thugs to help me. So all those would be. So this is a very general measurement framework. And what I would argue is if you look at the psychology literature on cognitive and non-cognitive skills, what you typically find is that a test score is treated as equivalent to one of these components of theta. Or health is typically like good health or bad health is equated to theta h, even though all these other factors matter. And we're going to show you they matter. The things like cognitive, non-cognitive skills really matter in the production of health. So this is equation 1. This is the outcome equation. This is the functionings equation. And then dynamic complementarity we talked about already. And here, it doesn't have to be complementarity. It could be substitutes. We started with initial conditions. Now I put in government inputs, parental inputs, investment, and theta t. And so we get this kind of recursive technology. These two equations, plus the formalization of parental preferences, would generate a lot. Let me just talk about the complementarity because it's received a lot of attention, although I think we also want to consider substitutability. We think of complementarity in the static sense, right? If you have more one input, supermodularity, really. You don't need differentiability. We're basically just saying, okay, the higher the stock, the higher the productivity of investment. But there's also the notion of a dynamic complementarity. And the dynamic complementarity, as a result of my investment, I can boost the stock that's operating J periods down the road here. I guess, I don't know what my symbol is, but basically I can actually boost the productivity in future periods, S greater than T. And that also is a kind of complementarity between current investment and future investment. And it's through boosting that stock. That's a dynamic complementarity. And so I suggested that, yeah, it depends on all the intermediate steps. We could actually have initial period substitutability and final period complementarity, because down the road we acquire complementarity. So complementarity is almost a synonym for inflexibility. It gets harder and harder to substitute, right? That's really what's going on. And that's the life cycle dynamic. So I want to argue, actually, the evidence is pointing towards more and more growth of complementarity with age. And maybe, when you look at the early years, some evidence of substitutability, and maybe even strong substitutability early on. So we switch from like a substitution relationship to a much more highly complementary relationship as we get older. And then critical and sensitive period is kind of obvious. Critical period, you have to invest now or there's no good. So there are examples, for example, from the literature on biology. If you're born blind, if you're born with a cataract, you can't see. If you remove the cataract at an early age, you can see. If you try to remove the cataract 5 years from now, you can't see, at least with current technology. So there are a lot of examples. Iron deficiency, if you don't give the kid enough iron early on, the kid's going to have a low IQ, and so far we don't know how to substitute for it. And then productivity of investments, again, these should be defined at precisely the same arguments. And varying in investment, there are periods where there's more where investment's higher than another period, that's going to be a sensitive period. And there's some evidence of critical and sensitive periods. I go back to this diagram, which I'm going to return to repeatedly, and try to look at this. So I think this is probably a good time to break. Or we can stop, or we can talk about economics and psychology. Or, are there any questions, though? I'm droning on indefinitely. Any people exhausted? Want to stop? It's a nice day. Oh, yes, Rebecca.
You were presenting the model with credit constraints, and that the ratio of early to later investment was lower than the optimal ratio?
The second model of credit constraints. That's within a lifetime, yes.
I was wondering if you consider the timing of birth to be endogenous?
No, not in this. Now, that would be actually another factor which would operate against. Although, again, when you get back to this information issue and self-control issue, see, that's where these issues start to get interrelated. If you look at the parenting practices of a 13, 14-year-old girl who's having a child out of wedlock, typically you're finding that not only are there judgments about certain things, they're not very mature, they make a lot of mistakes, they simply don't have a lot of knowledge. And you could argue that would be another kind of constraint that's operating here in this environment, which I haven't really allowed for in this setting. But
Maybe people
Yeah, but I'm saying they may have the limitation that they don't. See, so part of this issue, we know that there's a big literature about cognitive constraints. So we know that in terms of financial literacy, financial planning, and so forth, I know that Leibson has a paper a few years ago now with Gabex and a few others pointing out that, you know, there's this age profile, it's an old result in psychology, that your pure ability to solve abstract problems reaches a peak about 19 to 20. Most of you are past it, by the way. Sorry, you're already down on the downhill side. But compensating is this capacity, acquired judgment. So you get basically called fluid and crystallized intelligence. And so they came up with this number that said around age 53 was the peak age for financial literacy. Because you're still smart enough, your cognitive ability was still reasonably good at 53, and your acquired skills in terms of crystallized intelligence was increasing. They would actually offset each other, and the peak age is 53. We do know that people make a lot of mistakes. I mean, there's just no question about it. And that's been very well studied, and it's partly related to IQ, and sometimes in very strange ways, right? That very smart people frequently make mistakes because they want to appear to answer questions quickly, right? This Shane Frederick cognitive reflection test shows that high IQ people sometimes make hugely bad mistakes. So they want to show how quick they are, how smart they are. They'd rather be smart looking than actually smart, but that's another story. So there are these mistakes, and that would show up for the teenage girl and show up for these. So there's a range of these constraints that aren't captured in this model. Here it's just looking at pure credit constraints and saying, and here I even had, I had a one-parent family here. It's just basically this kind of standard model of a mother and a daughter reproducing over multiple generations, really asexually reproducing. There's no timing decision here. But if I put it in, I would think that these non-cognitive constraints matter a lot. That's been found as to be a major predictor of out-of-wedlock births, for example. But that's kind of more than you ask, so, okay? So what I'd like to do is pick up with some evidence on this, or we could talk further about these models, or we could talk more about economics and psychology. I'm very flexible. We have some time, but I think right now I'm getting hoarse, so. Question?
Should we take a 10-minute break?
That should be fine. 10-minute break, yeah. And we stay here till midnight tonight, right? So dinner will be brought in. Now what I'm going to do is talk about some of the data and some of the work on health. So there will be a structure of and some of the econometrics associated with this. I haven't even talked about the econometrics yet.